I've been a busy boy this summer and I've read some great books and some not so great books. In this video, I'm going to talk about which ones are which. Before I go any further, if you're interested in full written reviews of these books or just generally what I'm reading at any given moment, then I have a Goodreads, there'll be a link in the description, and there's also the Simon Oxford's book club, which is coming back. More about that at the end of the video. To begin with, a book which I talked about in the previous book video, The Master Algorithm by Pedro Domingos. Now, I had read the very start of this book when I made that last video, and I read this on holiday, and I don't know if you can see, but it's a very, very battered copy. It travelled quite a way with me. I think depending on who you are, this is either a 3-star book or a 5-star book. I think if you're going into it like me, as someone with a lot of experience in programming, specifically, if you're going into it as someone who's sort of a computer scientist in any way, it's a 3-star book. It's kind of a frustrating read, and I'll get to why. Whereas I think if you're coming into this with no expertise in programming or computers really, then you're going to find it absolutely fascinating. So why do I draw that distinction? It's because the book basically goes through the ways in which machine learning works, right? So there are different ways of making a computer learn how to do a task. There's a figure in here which actually surmises it very, very neatly. It's here. I'll do a close-up on it. So the book basically puts across that there are different camps of machine learning. There's symbolists and Bayesians and connectionists and evolutionaries, and basically lots of different ways of approaching the same problem using different techniques. And I think what I got out of it as a programmer was basically that fact and a kind of basic idea of how those things work. But what it lacked was what I thought necessary detail. And in particular, not having equations, which I can understand in a general book. Most people are kind of intimidated by equations. I think Stephen Hawking was told that for every one that he put in A Brief History of Time, that the viewership would halve. So I think he put 2, or possibly just 1 in. So, I can understand why they haven't. Pedro Domingos hasn't. But he's effectively expressing in words what you would put in an equation. So I could read in one line what he describes in 2 or 3 pages, and it's just a bit frustrating to read when you have that kind of training and you're like, that's like, I know that you can express this better. This is just like fluff. That said though, the book definitely did make me interested in machine learning, and I've got a few ideas for videos actually I'd like to do based on some of the techniques that I learned in this book. In order to do that, I am now going to have to go and find specific papers. And to the book's credit, it does give at the back a list of sort of recommended reading if you're interested in the technical aspects. This, at the end of the day, is a primer. It's an introduction to the field. It's not a textbook or anything like that. So, don't expect that. I think if you come into this expecting just to kind of get a sense of what machine learning means and how you can do it in different ways and a postulated way that, you can connect those different ways, that's what the master algorithm is. And then also, at the end of the book, a really fascinating chapter on how machine learning could change the world and how, using it as a technique could completely revolutionize, for example, treating cancer. That aspect of it is fascinating. So I would recommend this to pretty much anyone, with the proviso and sort of the caveat that if you are a scientist, don't expect equations, don't expect a huge amount of detail, and expect to have to do extra reading after this, because you almost certainly will find it interesting and will want to, and unfortunately will have to. Next, a much less satisfying book, Eureka by Andrew Gregory. Now, I find Greek science fascinating. I find sort of the history of science one of the most interesting things about the whole field. And so I was given this book and, told it's basically an overview of Greek science. And I was thinking, fantastic. You have the philosophical arguments about how they approach science, how they approach the world, a kind of, an interesting look at some of the key individuals like Pythagoras or Aristotle. And, it had so much potential. And it utterly failed to deliver. As I say on my Goodreads review, this is basically a list. This book is just a list of, in this field, this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And I get that is kind of what history is at its most basic form, but you're missing all the analysis that comes on top of that. You're missing, characterization of the important people. And I know they lived a long time ago, it's difficult to know a huge amount about them, but there's so many more interesting stories that I know, having only read a little bit about this field before. I was expecting this to be kind of like, it's a relatively thin book. I thought it would be a kind of, not a merry jaunt, but you know what I mean? It was going to be like a fun kind of introduction, leaning on characterization of the individuals and sort of going through the chronology. Yes, this happened, then this happened, then this happened, but giving some overarching themes of the transition, towards a slightly more rational society. And then, even touching on how that affected the world and then how it also kind of faded away up until the Renaissance. And I just felt like this book really didn't give that. I think, to be honest, the only kind of person who might find this actually a valuable read is someone who knows absolutely nothing about Greek science and is a kid. But to be honest, there's not very much to talk about in this book because I found very little that I liked about it. You know, it was a bit of a struggle to get through because it was just boring. There are better ones out there. I'd give this one a miss. Next up, my mandatory Warhammer book of the sort of video. This is the Magus by Dan Abnett, and I absolutely loved it. Dan Abnett is by far and away my favourite Black Library author. I think, you know, if you take him out of the Black Library, he is just a great author, regardless of what he's writing about. And he has, you know, he's listed as a writing credit, for example, for Guardians of the Galaxy. Like he's written well outside the Warhammer universe. He's written Judge Dredd. He's written Guardians. There's a bunch of other stuff which I can't remember off the top of my head. And the stuff that he writes in this book, which is part of a trilogy of trilogies, except this is book number 4 in the first trilogy, so it's 2 trilogies and a quadrilogy, it's the best stuff the Black Library does. It's basically, most of the books which Games Workshop publish are about war. That's kind of, it's got Warhammer, you know, it's in the name. This stuff is all about the domestic side of things. It's about the really rich setting that's been built up over decades of other authors and people playing the games. And I mean, I've read about 10,000 pages of Warhammer lore, and I feel like I've just about scratched the surface. And this is the stuff that is sort of the richest. It gives you the best overview of it, and I absolutely love the Inquisition books. A super quick review for those of you who are interested. This book is actually a novel which is probably about half of the runtime. The page count. And the other half is a series of short stories. And what this book does actually is it kind of glues together the trilogy of trilogies in a very neat way. And it actually has a reading order at the start. It says, you know, these are the other books in the series. You should read this one, then the first short story, the next one, then the next short story, and then going all the way through. And then this is kind of the linchpin in a way of a lot of the series, and I am very tempted to go back and read the rest of them, basically, because I enjoyed this one so much. If you like 40k, absolutely read the Inquisition books so you can get to this one. Next, a book which I don't actually have with me, so it's going to float up here, is Total Recall by Arnold Schwarzenegger. So I've been kind of fascinated by Arnold Schwarzenegger for quite a while. I think, as I said in my Goodreads review, he kind of represented this super saturated, super masculine Hollywood ideal when I was a kid. You know, I was born just before Terminator 2 came out. And so for all through the 90s, he was this ultimate action star. And then he became the governor of California. And then when I became interested in bodybuilding and going to the gym, he obviously is like the paradigm of that. So he's kind of followed me for several decades, actually. Most of my life, I've been aware of him in different aspects. So when I was given this book as a present quite a while ago, and I finally got around to reading it, it was actually everything I hoped it would be. It was a very, very good autobiography. Because he was active in so many different sectors during his life, the book is kind of split between bodybuilding and the movie business and the governing business. And if you're interested in any of those things, you're going to find this book interesting because it's, you know, a massive figure in any one of those fields. This is an important account. But I think what I got most of all from this book was the attitude that he has to everything in his life, because he is a phenomenally successful person. He has done stuff which I disagree with, and you know, I wouldn't want to be him necessarily, but he has undoubtedly been very successful at what he has turned his attention to. And a lot of that has to do with his mindset, which is basically, it's all about putting in the effort. It's all about the repetitions that you do on an exercise or on a line or on a speech, and just basically being willing to try. And that was the main takeaway from the book, and it's an attitude which I've sort of taken from him before, from speeches I've seen. I'll leave a link in the description, actually. There's an amazing speech of his rules of success, which kind of echo his conclusions in his autobiography. And, you know, it was just a very motivational book. You can't not read this book and then think, yeah, I want to do stuff. I can, if he can do all this stuff, I can do some of this too. I mean, I don't think I'm ever going to be Mr. Olympia, but you know, maybe. No, I think I'm going to be applying the lessons of this book in other ways, but it was very motivational. I immediately lent it to a friend, actually, because I was like, you need to read this. So, highly, highly recommended. Quite an easy read as well, quite long, but nice, easy holiday reading. Then, lastly, and a book I have been so excited to talk about, is La Belle Sauvage by Philip Pullman. Oh, I love this book. So for the 5 people in the world who might not know, Philip Pullman wrote a trilogy called his Dark Materials, which is Northern Lights or the Golden Compass, Subtle Knife, and The Amber Spyglass. And they are like a monumental piece of children's fiction. They are so ambitious, so well written, terribly adapted into film, but actually there is the BBC series that's coming soon. And a massive part of my childhood. I absolutely loved those books. I've read them twice all the way through. My dad has read them about 3 times, because when the first came out, I was at the age when my parents would read Northern Lights to me, the first couple of chapters, and eventually I was like, I just got to plow on and do it myself. I'd bitten the bug, but also my parents had, because they read some of the chapters. So it's just so absolutely love the world that he's created in those books. And this is the follow-up. It's actually a prequel. It's a prequel to the trilogy, and it actually deals with sort of a key character in it is the baby who becomes Lyra in his Dark Materials, one of the kind of the protagonist of the whole arc. And it's just reading this book, it was like going back to being a kid, because the world that he's created, you just immediately fell back in love with. If you haven't read the books, the main difference, I mean, there are lots of subtle differences between the world that Lyra lives in and our world, but the main difference is that people have demons, which is their soul in animal form. And so kids' demons keep changing, but adults' demons are set in a particular form. So the protagonist, Malcolm, in this, I think his mum's demon is a badger, for example, and if you're like a steeplejack or a carpenter, their demon was like a woodpecker, and so the form that your soul takes in demon form says a lot about who you are as a person, and that's just one example of how the world is different, and just the way that he writes in that world is masterful. I think Philip Pullman is one of my absolute favourite authors. I've had the pleasure of meeting him, actually. I got him to sign my copy of Northern Lights, which I geek out every time I think about it. This book just felt like coming back to that world, but with differences in tone. I think I'm right in saying that this book is not meant for children. His Dark Materials is definitely a children's trilogy, but this has, for example, a bunch of swearing in. Tonally, there are a few things which are a little bit distinct, I think, from Northern Lights and the other books. So it's the same but different, and I just yeah. In case you can't tell, I absolutely loved reading this book. If I was to offer some criticism, I'd say that the beginning is perfect, absolutely perfect. And you can kind of divide the book into 2, really. I think it actually is divided into 2 parts of, I won't spoil it, but before a flood and after a flood. And I feel like before the flood is flawless. I genuinely wouldn't change a single thing. I felt like as the flood half of the book went on, it got more and more abstract, and I felt like it ended very abruptly. And I felt like it was taking me out of the book a little bit. There's a key sort of couple of chapters towards the end where everything does get very abstract, and considering how grounded the rest of the book is in reality. And from memory, I am now going to go and reread his Dark Materials. From memory, the other books are all very grounded they always have a sense of reality. The stuff at the end of this, which wasn't, definitely stood out, and it took me out of the book in kind of an unpleasant way, and it ends very abruptly, really. I know that this is the first book of 3, although I've heard rumours that the second book is actually meant to be after Lyra's adventures in his Dark Materials, so I'm a bit confused by that. But yeah, not absolutely flawless, but pretty close to it. I mean, I think if you enjoyed his Dark Materials, you'd be a fool to not read this. And actually, there's one more thing. Take the dust cover off. Look at how gorgeous the book itself is. Like, I'm going to gingerly open it. You've got all the dust on either side, and then the quote from Lord Asriel on the spine. I physically loved the book, and I loved its contents. I loved reading it. You'd be a fool not to read it. And if you haven't read his Dark Materials, absolutely do that. Probably do that first, then read this. Okay, so those are the books which I have read over the summer. And now, coming up, some really good books. As has been requested for so long, I finally got myself a copy of Homo Deus, which my girlfriend immediately stole. I've only just got it back. Oh, she left her bookmark in here. Oh wow, she only made it halfway through. I loved Sapiens. It was one of my favourite books of all time, so I can't wait to dig into this. For those of you who aren't aware, there'll be a link in the description. I did a video review of Sapiens on its own because it's another book which was requested several times over, and I am very, very excited to finally own because it was bought for me as a birthday present. The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. I've heard so many good things about this book. So many friends have been screaming at me to read it for years. I finally have it, and I will be getting onto this as probably my next fiction book. I tend to read one non-fiction and one fiction, so that's probably going to be the next fiction now that I've finished La Belle Sauvage. But most excitingly, the book club is back, and we are reading A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. Now, you may remember that we said that we were going to read this before. That was me and my friend Dan who were going to read this book, and one of us didn't, so I'm reinstating the book club. In about a month's time, there will be a video talking about just this book, not lots of them, but just this one, having a deep dive on what I think about it, and I would encourage you to read it too. Like I said at the start of the video, there is a Goodreads group, which is the book club for this channel, down there in the description. So you can join that, anybody can join it and get involved in the discussion there, and we'll all read this book together. There's like 1,000 people in that group, so it's actually quite a lot of us. We'll all read the book, we'll report back in about a month with what we relatively thought. I have read this before. I gave a crack at reading this in primary school, which means that I probably didn't understand about 90% of it, and it's such an iconic book that I've got to give it a proper adult read. So very, very excited about this one, and very excited to be reading something again with you guys, and actually having a proper deep dive and hearing your thoughts on the book too. So these are the first 3 things which I'm going to be reading. There are a bunch more things downstairs, including books which I've been sent, and I feel terrible for not reading, but I've just been so busy that I've barely had a chance to read. But I've started reading every night before bed. My girlfriend and I now have like a 15-minute timer. We both read before bed, so hopefully I'll actually start to churn through these relatively quickly compared to what I did this summer. Have you read any of these books? Because if so, I would like to hear your thoughts on them as well. Leave them down there in the comments. Please. You can recommend stuff to me. I was going to say please don't, but of course you can recommend stuff to me to read as well, but be aware I've got an awful lot of books to read as it is. Mostly I'm interested to hear what you've been reading, especially if you've been reading stuff that I've been reading, so we can compare notes. So put those down in the comments. Thank you very much for watching this video. I love doing these book videos. I just don't do them very frequently because it takes a while to read, But if you enjoyed it, do pop it a like and share it if you thought it was worth sharing, because that sort of says to me that I should do more of them. And yeah. Thank you again for watching. I'll see you in the next one.